So next we're going to talk about human cell-based assays and toxicity testing. Reza and Norbert, we are participants here, and be it resolved that animal models provide a sufficient basis for presumption for toxicity in safety testing. So, Reza?
Thanks, Gary. So my name is Reza Rasoulpour, and I lead the Predictive Safety Center at Dow AgroSciences. Consistent with this debate, I'm going to wear the hat that animal models are what we need. Okay, got to shake that off. Here we go. Whenever we talk to people who are promoting human in vitro-based systems to completely replace animal systems, for the human in vitro cell lines to be the gold standard instead of the animal models, the example that they always bring up is estrogen receptor. And we just heard it, right? It's a very simple, in relative terms, interaction of agonism or antagonism on a single receptor. What we're going to talk about today to make the story a lot more complex is real science and immunotoxicology, where things become really complicated. And I have the good fortune of going against a world premier immunotoxicologist and former Society of Toxicology president, and then there's me, a guy. So I had to learn a little bit more about immunology, but immunology, as we all know, is very complex, right? We're not talking about a single interaction on a single receptor. We're talking about innate immunity. We're talking about adaptive immunity. We're talking about latent types of effects. There are physical barriers. There are multiple cell types, multiple tissues, multiple components that are all related to immunology. And when we think about this from the context of immunotoxicology, it is all about providing that balance, one way or the other. And this is from a book chapter, Castrate and Dulce by Kaminsky et al. And you see here that it is all about this balance, remaining in that good place and not going in one direction of overstimulation and being in an autoimmunity hypersensitivity situation, or understimulation and being in an infection or cancer. So suppression would lead in this direction, immunoenhancement would lead in that direction. So it's a complex system that's constantly in balance and changes throughout life stages, changes throughout multiple different types of exposure. So what do we do in order to try to deal with this from a testing standpoint? We do a number of different assays, but one of those assays looking specifically at the hypersensitivity component of this is a skin sensitization series of assays. One of those assays is the local lymph node assay. This is a skin sensitization test, really important for industrial chemicals, for pesticides, for all different types of exposures. You want to understand if you can result in a skin sensitization reaction as a result into that exposure. So very relevant. And the way that the assay works in simplest form is that you have a mouse, you provide the material, you then reprovide the material, so go through an induction phase and then elicitation phase, and you basically look to see what sort of infiltrate you get within the lymph node over a period of time. Now, there's been a lot of research done on alternative methods for this particular approach, and there are many. There's the HCLAT, there's the direct peptide reactivity assay, and there's a really popularized assay, the keratinescence assay, popularized by Nash and used by many others, that looks at this particular endpoint and boils it down into its key components, and there's an in vitro alternative that is very good for that particular endpoint. So this is the keratinescence assay. It uses a NRF, ARE type situation, a stable promoter reporter situation, and is very useful from a prioritization standpoint, from an assessment standpoint for skin sensitization. But that's one very, very small part of the whole world of immunotoxicology. And that may tell us that, hey, this is great, we figured this part out, let's go all in vitro, let's go in vitro human, because it is true, a mouse is not a human. And Dr. Kaminsky is going to explain that to you, and I can tell you that, I agree with him, a mouse is not a human. But in vivo is not in vitro, and we oversimplify things if we try to do this. Because if we look at all of the possible indicators of immunotoxic effects that can occur following evaluation of chemicals, it's not just simple reactions. We're talking about increased mortality due to infectious agents, neoplasia, altered hematology, changes in tissue structure, changes in histopathology. How is that going to be recapitulated within an in vitro system? And if we broaden this even further into, again, the chapter by Castrate and Dulce, these are all the particular endpoints that we're looking at when we're thinking about immunotoxicology. You see multiple cell types there, multiple tissues, and interactive situations. So what do? And the analogy that I want to use for you is that just because a concept can be attractive and good in theory, you really need to think about all the other aspects of it before you jump in with both feet. And this analogy will be bike lanes. Bike lanes are a great thing. Gary Ginsberg loves bike lanes because you can bike to different places. It's wonderful, share the road, and it's a utopian society where there's cars and buses and this nice little divider and people driving on the bike lanes. But the problem is that in order to have that actually work well, you need to execute it and design it well. So in some situations it works. In some situations with poor design, you may not have actually thought through the ramifications of putting a tree in the middle of the bike lane. Or perhaps you have thought of it and you've designed it really well, but there's some unexpected component to this. You expect the cars, you expect the buses, you expect all that. Did someone expect that snow would block the bike lane? Right? They're unexpected challenges. So there are things that are great in theory, but can end up being challenging in practice. And the problem is that with complex toxicology, like immunotoxicology, multiple cell types, this is a really hard thing to recapitulate in vitro, and we're simply not there yet. Here's a paper that's by Hartung and Corsini that lists all the different challenges that exist in order to try to address immunotoxicology and bring that into the in vitro setting. And I'm just going to go through a couple of these and blow it up for you for the seats in the back. So basically what these say are the standard things up front with regard to toxicokinetics, biotransformation. And then the concepts that we were talking about here, physical chemical space, interference with the in vitro system. If you have a high KOW, are you really going to be getting what you think you're getting on the other side? A more critical thing specifically related to immunotoxicology is that interaction of different cell types. How do you actually get multiple neuroimmunoendocrine cell types, endocrine tissues, endocrine signaling to interact with one another? What about just induction of a memory response? Do we have the right in vitro tools in order to do this? Do we have a system where we can look at recovery? That's a real key aspect of all of this, right? Recovery from a particular insult can be really important in understanding the impact of that particular toxicant or chemical. What about 3D architecture, lymphoid architecture? That's really key in assessing immunotoxicology, and the in vitro methods simply aren't there yet. Continuing on, we have an existing database in animals. That has been our gold standard. If we start utilizing these other in vitro tools, if we're not linking those up, how do we bridge back to our existing database and gain confidence? Omic technologies can help us, but it's only part of the equation. What about antibody production assays? What about the current gold standard, which is the TDAR assay? From a regulatory standpoint, there is no assay in vitro in order to provide this as an alternative. And a stimulator, we need to identify a stimulator. And at the end of the day, just more basic methods needed for true autoimmunity assessment. There are real gaps that are here that we need to address and that a whole animal model provides us. In addition to all these specific technical gaps, there's a more overall thinking related to immunotoxicology that I want to bring to the table, which is that concept of a spectrum. When we're looking at an animal in an in vivo system or even a human population, with something as complex as a balance of immunotoxicology, there is a side to it. There's an immunosuppression, immunoactivation. I showed you that balance act before. And balancing and remaining within that normal range, there's a lot of duplicativity within the system. So you may have a particular challenge that an in vivo animal has no problem addressing, will not result in any sort of significant result. So it's the difference between if a signal is seen in an in vitro setting, in an artificial setting, looking at one particular aspect of a molecular pathway, will that actually mean anything when you translate that to a whole animal system? Will some small perturbation here actually result in pushing the spectrum one way or the other? And it comes down to your in vitro tools may provide a snapshot into particular aspects of the pathways related to immunotoxicology, but can they really integrate the continuum together in a meaningful way so that you know the difference between statistical significance or even a signal of something happening and actually be able to put it into context for biological significance. So in conclusion, in vitro models, particularly related to immunotoxicology, do not recapitulate ADME biotransformation, cell-cell interactions, induction of memory response, recovery, tissue architecture, antibody production, autoimmunity, immunostimulation, the complex push-pull nature of the immune system. And a key aspect of all of this that we don't want to forget is if we get a positive in our in vitro system, okay, that's all right. What if they all turn out negative? How much confidence can we really have in a negative battery of in vitro assays for that to be the gold standard? Aren't we worried that something is going to slip through the cracks? As such, the animal model should remain the gold standard for immunotoxicology. Otherwise, we will simply have a false sense of security. Thank you.